I don't know about you, but I don't have massive hands. You know, the sort of hands where you hold up a loaf of bread and it looks more like a crusty roll. They are normal-sized hands. I mean, they can span an octave on a piano, and I'm not quite sure why else you might want to stretch any further than that. But they do have a limit when you're talking about gaming devices, and one of those things that put me off trying the TrimUI Brick originally was the size of it. I hadn't had an experience with something that was quite so small. I was worried that my hands would cramp or that they wouldn't find a comfortable position. As it was, I ended up really liking it. And then LitNXT sent me something that I hadn't even considered trying, the GKD Pixel 2. It's slightly bigger than the original Pixel, only slightly. And I think it's slightly bigger than the RG Nano as well, but it's still a very compact unit. And my first thought was, I am never going to be able to play this. It's just too small. It's as if somebody has taken the concept of portability too far. You could pull this out during a meeting only for your colleague to go, "Is that Mario playing on your USB stick?" And it wasn't just the controls that I was worried about. The screen is tiny as well, and I thought you'd have to hold it much closer to your face, probably hunched over, and I thought, I can't play like this. I'm going to end up looking like Gru from Despicable Me. So when this arrived, I didn't have a particularly high hopes for this unit, and it is tiny. The box that it comes in is tiny. I've got the box here. It's not much bigger than the size of the console, and you'd be forgiven that thinking it contains one of those novelty books, you know, the sort of that you buy as a stocking filler, or maybe a slightly misshapen deck of playing cards. You don't get a lot in here, unlike some of the other devices. You know, all you've got in here is the instruction manual and the USB cable, but really, that's all you need. Because when you actually take this out of the packet, and when I got this in my hands, I suddenly realized what the point of it was. This little thing is incredible. I mean, it looks incredible, even the green color. You know, I'm not the biggest fan of metallic green, but this stands out, and yet it's not that sort of sickly, annoying green that I've seen on a couple of other units. It actually looks really nice. It's that touch more desaturated. And on the metal body, it gives it a certain glow, a certain je ne sais quoi. Right out of the box, I was impressed by the build quality. The buttons, the metal body, the angles, the ridges, everything seems to come together to make it an interesting device. It's CNC-machined aluminium, it's cold to the touch, weighs about as much as a particularly lackluster sandwich. And when you hold it, there's this moment where your brain goes, yes! This is a quality object. Immediately followed by, Christ, where's it gone? Oh, it's hiding behind my pinky. This thing occupies a weird space between impressively premium and aggressively impractical. The screen is gorgeous. The build quality makes other handhelds feel like they're held together with optimism and friction. But I've spent more time with my hands cramping than I have since I learnt to play the Hell Freezes Over version of Hotel California back in the mid-90s. Even so, the retro handheld community has been falling over itself about this device since it was released. And perhaps that's to be expected. The original units became collector's items. And that's because the device itself is something that some other units forget about. It's fun. It has everything going for it to make this a serious collector's item and a solid choice for playing certain games, but instead, it seems like it just wants to enjoy itself. You don't pick this up to have the best gaming experience in the world. You pick this up because it just makes you smile. But of course, this isn't going to be for everybody, and I mean, the sheer size alone shows you that. So you do have to ask yourself, is this going to be worth the months of physiotherapy that you might have to go through when your fingers have decided to seize up after playing it for too long? Well, let's find out if the GKD Pixel 2 is pixel perfect or a tiny inconvenience. When you first take this out of the box, your first thought before anything else is, gosh, it's cold. because this has been CNC machined to within an inch of its life. And I've reviewed handhelds before that claim to have a premium build quality, where what they actually mean is that they've used a slightly thicker plastic in the hope that nobody will notice. But this isn't that. This is a small brick of aluminium that somebody's hollowed out and filled with retro gaming. The first time you pick it up, there's this moment of, so now I see why this costs $70. The shell is gorgeous, and whilst I've got the green version, it's also available in purple, red, blue, and there's a few special editions in pink and gold for people who want to let everybody know that they've spent far too much money on their toy. This unit was sent over by Lit NXT, but that hasn't coloured my review at all. They've no editorial control over this. In fact, I've got no editorial control over this. I'm just a bit of a mess at the moment, if I'm honest. But look, they won't see this before it goes out, and I can say anything I like about this unit. And I will say, though, I have ordered several things through Lit NXT in the past, and, you know, they've been very good. Way before they reached out, is one of the first companies I bought through was Lit NXT, and I would wholeheartedly recommend this company. Now, the back of this thing has these ribbed grooves for your pleasure. They look nice, but they don't really do much to actually improve your grip. And that's because, you know, I might have mentioned this before, but this thing is tiny. It measures 81 by 63 by 17 millimeters, which is actually about the size of a large box of matches. And at 114 grams, this thing is nice and light as well. Although you may think it's lighter than it actually is to begin with. There's this weird thing that your brain does where it sees something metal and it expects it to weigh far more than it actually does. So when you first pick this up, it feels really light. And then after a few minutes, it feels exactly as heavy as physics told you it should be. Under the hood, we have the Rockchip RK3326S with 1GB of DDR3 RAM. You don't have any Bluetooth or Wi-Fi, but you do have an 1800 milliamp hour battery, which is good for around about 3 to 6 hours of gameplay, although that dips on much heavier systems. But the real talking point here is the screen. It's 2.4 inches, which sounds absurdly tiny until you realise that they have crammed 460 by 480 pixels into it. That's a pixel density of about 333 pixels per inch. For context, that's higher than most modern smartphones. Apple would likely call this a retina display, and whilst that's not a term I'm particularly fond of because it sounds like a lot of marketing nonsense, you can't actually see individual pixels on this screen unless you're deliberately looking for them with a magnifying glass, which I did. I'm not married. The result is that 8-bit, 16-bit games, they look absolutely stunning on this machine, even though it's quite small. Game Boy Advance games in particular look better than they have any right to. The GBA aspect ratio leaves bars at the top and bottom of the screen, so you'd think you'd have even less real estate. But you can really see the colours popping, and the art is so sharp that you could cut yourself on it. The brightness range is excellent too. It'll go bright enough for outdoor use, which surprised me, and it's dim enough for playing in bed without turning your retinas into charcoal. And you know what? I quite like that in a gaming device, something that doesn't blind me at 3 o'clock in the morning. I think of that as considerate. But you have to understand what this screen size means in practical terms. For the vast majority of games, you're going to have a pretty good experience with them. But for anything which is text heavy or anything that relies on, small icons on the screen, you're going to start having trouble. It's just a tiny bit too small for those games. You might find yourself holding this at increasingly bizarre distances for your face, like a middle-aged man trying to hold on to his youth and insisting that he doesn't need glasses, even though he just tried to pinch and zoom on a packet of chocolate Bourbons. The sound is actually surprisingly good. You've only got one single downwards facing speaker here, which you wouldn't think would do very much. And actually, in some instances, this isn't very loud. It doesn't have the best bass response. But the actual sound reproduction is fairly good. This isn't going to fill out the Albert Hall at the last night of the proms, but it's perfectly adequate for a good gaming session. And actually, it's probably quite good if you wanted to listen to certain bits of media from it as well. And you've also got the 3.5mm headphone jack, and that sounds perfectly fine. In fact, that is going to be a better experience if you want great sounding games on this unit. Control-wise, this is pretty good. The D-pad is responsive, it's accurate, it's actually pretty perfect for retro games. You can happily perform the Kirby pancake test, which I think I'm going to try and immortalize that in a t-shirt one day. But you don't get any false diagonals with this. You do sometimes have a little bit of a difficulty hitting the diagonals when you want. And it's something that you really need to train your muscle memory for. But after a couple of hours of playing with this thing on and off, you kind of get used to it. The buttons, on the other hand, I suppose are a little bit spongy. Now look, I quite like them. They're not, oh God, I really hate these, spongy, but they're definitely lacking in a sort of crisp tactile click that you sometimes get with mechanical switches. I've seen some reviewers say that they're mushy, which I think is a bit harsh, but I do understand where they're coming from. If you're coming from something like the Miu Mini, which has clicky buttons, and God forbid an actual NES controller, this is going to feel softer and less precise. I think they're fine, I think they work, and they're responsive in game. They're actually very nice and quiet as well, and they don't sound like you're tap dancing on a biscuit tin. The shoulder buttons, though, are a little bit of a letdown. They're flush with the device, and I can see exactly why they've done it. I mean, it adds to the aesthetics, it adds to that overall design philosophy. But when you're playing, it can be difficult to reach to L2 and R2, and even stretching to R1 can be awkward. It's not a big stretch, it's just an awkward one, considering where the rest of the buttons are. Luckily, for these types of games, you're not going to be using the shoulder buttons quite as much as you would on some older consoles. But that does reveal the underlying problem with this console. It's not comfortable for long sessions. It's small and rectangular and with hard metal edges. Even about 30 to 40 minutes of playing with this, and your hands are going to start filing formal complaints. If you've got larger hands, I'd imagine that timeline would shrink significantly. Saying that you're going to get cramps with this sounds dramatic until you actually try holding it and pressing down on buttons when you'll suddenly realise that the GKD Pixel 2 could cause the start of carpal tunnel syndrome. But even that's kind of okay, because you've got to realise that this is a device that isn't designed for long gameplay. It's for short bursts of gaming. Pick up and play for a few minutes whilst you're on your lunch break. Performance-wise, we're told this would do up to PSP, and technically that's right. But some PS1 games and everything above that is a kind of nice to have on this thing. You've got a Rock chip RK3326S, which it's got 1GB of RAM. It's the same chip you'll find in various other budget handhelds, and it's not cutting edge by any stretch of the imagination. Everything 8-bit and 16-bit will run like a charm. There's no slowdown, there's no stutter. It's just smooth, clean emulation that looks fantastic on screen. So what's the problem with the other titles, and why are they suggesting that you can play them? Well, the fact is that technically you can. Out of the box, most PS1 titles will run very well, but demanding things, especially things with complex 3D environments, will show occasional frame drops and stuttering, especially during busier scenes. However, you can fix this. If you go into the RetroArch settings and manually overclock the emulated CPU, which involves increasing the clock speed by about 10 megahertz, suddenly everything smooths out. This isn't difficult to do or particularly technical, but it is manual tweaking that you have to do for yourself. Once done, PS1 performance is excellent, but it also suffers from the fact that it just doesn't have enough sticks. You can't play Ape Escape on this. Where this falls apart is with more demanding systems. So Mario Kart runs perfectly fine, but Ocarina of Time was a bit stuttery. Dreamcast emulation exists and it's playable, but actually for most titles, that might be a little bit generous. And PSP is technically possible, but the tiny 4x3-inch screen is just not suitable. You shouldn't buy this for N64, Dreamcast, or PSP. There are better, more powerful handhelds out there that shine with those systems, and this just isn't one of them. You get this instead because it's a fun little device that you can carry around with you easily and slip into a shirt pocket. In fact, this thing is so small, it will fit inside the coin pocket of my jeans. But then, I'm a big guy, I've got pretty big jeans. And before I finish, I really should talk about the system or what it's like when you first boot up. Because out of the box, the Pixel 2 runs a thing called IUX. And I've never come across this before. It's a fork of Rocknix with Gmenu 2X as the front end. And whilst it's functional, it's not what you'd really expect from a modern handheld. This is an older system. Boot time actually took quite a long time, which it doesn't ruin the whole pick up and play idea, but it does curtail it a little bit. And whilst it technically supports dongles, I couldn't get mine to work at all, which means no Wi-Fi. The general consensus is that you should immediately flash Plum OS, which is a custom firmware that improves basically everything. But the other thing that you can do here is switch to Emulation Station, and that's what I've done. And I actually quite like this better on this particular unit. But I did have my own frustration with the card that shipped with this. LitNXT sent me the standard 64 gig card that you get with this machine. And now, look, I always say, when you get a card with one of these things, back it up straight away and put that back up somewhere safe so that, you know, if something gets corrupted, you've got a fallback. And I didn't do that because I am a moron. Because this is a review unit. You know, I thought, well, I'll use it for a bit and then I'll get rid of it. I didn't think that there was enough time for the SD card to break. And I was completely wrong. It was about a week of using this device, and the SD card started to corrupt and I couldn't play certain systems. And what I had to do was rebuild a lot of this stuff on a brand new SD card. And whilst that wasn't too much of a hassle, if I'd backed this up originally, I wouldn't have had that problem at all. And I should say, this really isn't a problem with the unit itself. This is a problem with every SD card that you get from a manufacturer. You need to back these things up. So where does that leave us? Well, the GKD Pixel 2 is beautifully made, it's incredibly well designed, and it excels on anything which is 8 or 16-bit. And, you know, a lot of 32-bit as well. You can also have a carefully curated PS1 experience, Dreamcast N64. And it gives you something that fits into a tiny pocket, and yet it feels premium at the same time. This is not for everybody, not in any stretch of the imagination. And if you're worried about your eyesight, if you're worried about your hands, then you probably shouldn't get this thing because it is, and I keep saying this, tiny. It's also not reliable for N64 or PSP, but it will let you dabble in a few titles. In fact, looking at this in terms of what it can play kind of misses the point, because this is really a small collector's item, a little desk ornament that you can pick up and play games in. Perfect for a stocking filler, that kind of thing. Something that you can pull out in public and it won't get you arrested. It's for enthusiasts. It's for people who appreciate the craft of a well-made handheld and don't mind spending most of their time on a different device. This is something that you'll put in your pocket at the same time as your wallet, and you won't notice that you're carrying it around until suddenly you get that urge to whip it out for a quick session. I've enjoyed using this a lot more than I expected to. Even with the tiny form factor, there is actually something really satisfying about playing Pokemon in a coffee shop whilst everybody else is just staring at their phones. This feels special in a way that most handhelds don't. Because this thing, it isn't intrusive. It's not something that's going to get you noticed like some of the other devices on the market. It's a little bit like having a modern-day Tamagotchi. Whether it's worth the asking price and accepting some fairly significant compromises is entirely a matter for you. And I've thought long and hard about this, about whether having this has changed my own mind, and unfortunately, I don't think it has. You know, I was really pleasantly surprised by the Pixel 2. I like it a lot, but it's not something that I would buy for myself. It's just that little bit too small for me. And I hate saying that because it's a nice device and it's well crafted and you want to give them props for that. But anyway, that's it for this video. If you'd like to see more retro handheld stuff, then please do subscribe. I've got thoughts on several other devices. I've got a couple of other devices on their way at the moment, so I'll be sharing those soon. One of which, of course, is the RGDS. That's going to be an interesting thing because I'm going to be getting the retail unit rather than the review units that some of the other people have got. So that'll be interesting to look at an out-of-the-box experience. Anyway, I'd love to know why you might pick up the Pixel 2 or what makes you not get it. What's the thing that's putting you off? Drop your experiences and comments in the comments and experiences bit below, particularly if you've tried this with custom firmware, because I'm still on the fence about that and I might like to try that out. And until next time, thanks ever so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day and a fantastic rest of your week. And until next time, happy gaming.